It is one of the curiosities of life with Hercule Poirot that the most dangerous affairs often begin with the most civilized of invitations. A card upon heavy cream paper. A name one recognizes from the society columns. A date that falls, as if by accident, upon the very evening one had resolved to do nothing more strenuous than read the evening papers and retire early. But Poirot, as I have had cause to observe over many years of friendship, possesses a nose for trouble that no amount of eau de cologne can disguise. And on this particular occasion, the trouble arrived not by post, but by hand, delivered to the door of our rooms at Whitehaven Mansions by a woman whose beauty alone should have served as warning. It was a Thursday in late November, 1936. London had wrapped itself in one of those yellow fogs that turned the city into a gaslit stage, muffling the traffic and lending an air of unreality to the most ordinary street. I had come in from my club, damp and rather out of sorts, to find Poirot seated in his accustomed chair, a tisane at his elbow, his patent leather shoes gleaming beneath the standard lamp. He was reading, or rather, he was holding a book and staring into the middle distance with that look of intense concentration I knew so well. "Ah, Hastings," he said, without turning his head. "You have had a disappointing afternoon. The bridge was not to your liking, and Mrs. Dollington served those small sandwiches with the anchovy paste that you find so objectionable." I gaped. "How on earth? The crumb upon your lapel, mon ami. Anchovy paste leaves a distinctive discoloration upon brown tweed. Also, you have the expression of a man who has been dummy for 3 consecutive rubbers." Before I could frame a suitably indignant reply, there came a knock at the door. Not the deferential tap of our porter, nor the business-like rap of a tradesman, but something altogether more urgent. A woman's knock, if one can say such a thing, quick and insistent, with a note of barely suppressed agitation. Poirot's eyebrows rose a fraction. "Entrez," he called. The door opened, and the woman who entered changed the temperature of the room as surely as if she had brought the fog in with her. She was perhaps 30, tall, slender, and dressed with that severe elegance which costs a great deal of money and is designed to suggest it cost nothing at all. Her hair was dark, almost black, swept up beneath a small hat of grey felt. Her eyes were the sort that novelists describe as luminous, and for once the word was justified. They were large, very dark, and at that moment bright with fear. "Monsieur Poirot," her voice was low, with the faintest trace of an accent I could not immediately place. "I am he, madame. Please sit, you are distressed. Hastings, a glass of water, if you would be so kind." She sank into the offered chair with the controlled grace of a woman accustomed to being watched. Her gloved hands were clasped in her lap, and I noticed that the left glove bore a small tear at the seam. Recent, I thought, as though she had twisted the fabric in her anxiety. "My name is Helena Doranis," she said, and I saw Poirot's eyes sharpen with recognition. "I believe you may have heard of my husband, Alexander Doranis." "The collector," Poirot said. "But of course, Monsieur Doranis is celebrated for his collection of Ottoman antiquities. I've read of it in the journals. It is said to be one of the finest private collections in Europe." It was. Her voice trembled. Until 3 days ago, when the centerpiece of the collection, the Doranis dagger, was stolen. Poirot leaned forward. "The jeweled dagger of Sultan Mehmed, n'est-ce pas? The blade said to have been carried at the fall of Constantinople. I recall reading of its acquisition. Your husband purchased it from a dealer in Istanbul some 8 years ago for a sum that was never publicly disclosed, but was understood to be extraordinary." Mrs. Doranis nodded. £40,000. My husband considered it the greatest achievement of his life. She drew a breath that shuddered slightly. "And now it is gone. But that is not why I have come to you, Monsieur Poirot." "No?" "The dagger was stolen on Monday evening during a private viewing at our home in Eaton Square. 12 guests were present. My husband has refused to call the police. He insists on handling the matter himself, privately, through his own channels. Her hands tightened. But last night, one of those 12 guests was found dead. The silence that followed had a quality I can only describe as electric. Poirot's fingertips came together in that familiar cathedral shape. Dead, he repeated softly. And the manner of death? Stabbed. Helena Doranis's composure cracked, and for an instant the fear beneath it showed raw and unmistakable. Stabbed through the heart with a blade that the police believed to be, she swallowed, antique, Ottoman and jeweled. We arrived at number 14 on Eaton Square shortly before 6 o'clock that same evening. The fog had thickened, reducing the elegant facade to a pale suggestion of Portland stone and black railings. A single light burned in an upper window, giving the house the appearance of a face with one eye open, watchful, suspicious, unwelcoming. Helena Doranis had provided us with the essentials during the taxi ride. Her husband, Alexander Doranis, was 62 years of age, a man of Greek extraction who had made his fortune in shipping before devoting himself to the accumulation of historical artifacts. He was, she said, a man of formidable will and equally formidable temper, accustomed to controlling every aspect of his world. The theft of the dagger had not merely angered him. It had shaken him to a depth she had never before witnessed. Alexander does not show fear, she said quietly, watching the fog slide past the taxi's windows. He considers it a weakness, but since Monday evening he has been a different man. He locks himself in his study. He refuses food. He watches the door as though expecting someone specific. And the dead man? Poirot asked. Leonard Carew. He was... She hesitated, choosing her words with visible care. He was a dealer, art and antiquities. He had done business with my husband for years. They were not friends precisely, but there was a mutual dependence. Leonard knew the market. He knew the sellers, the buyers, the middlemen. Without him, Alexander could never have assembled the collection. And this Monsieur Carew, he was among the 12 guests on Monday evening? Yes. Where was his body discovered? In his flat in Bloomsbury. His housekeeper found him yesterday morning. The police have questioned us already. Inspector Sullivan of Scotland Yard. But Alexander told them nothing about the stolen dagger. He insists the two matters are unrelated. And you, madame? You do not share this view. Helena Doranis turned her luminous eyes upon Poirot. I believe my husband is protecting someone, Monsieur Poirot. I believe he knows who stole the dagger, and I believe that knowledge is what killed Leonard Carew. The butler who admitted us was a tall, gaunt individual with the bearing of a retired undertaker and the expression to match. He led us through a marble-floored entrance hall hung with tapestries and up a wide staircase to the first floor, where he knocked upon a pair of double doors with the deference of a man approaching a sovereign. Monsieur Poirot and Captain Hastings, sir. The room we entered was extraordinary. It occupied the entire front of the first floor, a vast space that had been converted into something between a drawing room and a museum. Glass display cases lined the walls, each illuminated from within, containing objects of bewildering variety and beauty. Curved scimitars with hilts of ivory and gold, illuminated manuscripts in cases of cedar, ceramic tiles in patterns of cobalt blue, carved jade bowls, and everywhere the gleam of precious metal and precious stone. At the far end, before a fireplace large enough to roast an ox, stood Alexander Doranis. He was a big man, not tall, but broad, with the heavy shoulders and thick neck of a wrestler gone to seed. His hair was silver, cropped close, and his face had the weathered hardness of one who had spent years at sea before retiring to the comforts of Eaton Square. He wore a dinner jacket, though it was barely evening, and held a glass of something amber that he did not appear to be drinking. So, he said. His voice was deep, accented, carrying the weight of a man unaccustomed to being contradicted. My wife has brought the detective. He looked at Helena, and the look contained anger, but also something else. something I could not quite identify. Resignation, perhaps, or dread. Monsieur Doranis. Poirot advanced with a small bow. I'm grateful for the opportunity to— Let us not pretend, Monsieur Poirot. Doranis set down his glass. Helena has told you about the dagger. She has told you about Leonard. She has, I imagine, told you that I'm hiding something. He turned his gaze upon his wife, and she met it without flinching. She is not wrong. The admission surprised me. Poirot, characteristically, showed nothing. Then perhaps, monsieur, you will tell Hercule Poirot what it is that you hide. Dorani moved to one of the display cases. An empty one, I noticed, its glass door standing open, its velvet interior bearing the ghostly impression of something long and narrow that had rested there for years. The dagger was here, he said. For 8 years it sat in this case. I could see it from my desk. I could see it from my chair by the fire. I could see it when I woke in the night and came down here, as I often did, simply to look at it. His voice softened with an intensity that was almost tender. You cannot understand what it meant to me, Monsieur Poirot. It was not merely an object, it was proof. Proof that a man who began with nothing, a boy from Piraeus who loaded cargo on the docks, could possess something that sultans had held, something that had witnessed the fall of an empire. He turned from the case. On Monday evening I held a viewing. 12 guests, trusted associates, old friends, fellow collectors. I wished to show them my latest acquisition, a set of Iznik tiles from the 16th century. The dagger was in its case, as always. At 10:30, when the last guest departed, it was gone. The case was locked? Always. I alone have the key. Doranis reached into his waistcoat pocket and produced a small brass key on a chain. This key, it has not left my person. And yet the case was opened without damage, without a scratch. The lock was turned as neatly as if I'd done it myself. Poirot examined the case with minute attention. He ran a gloved finger along the frame, peered at the lock through his magnifying glass, and sniffed, yes, sniffed, the velvet interior. A copy of the key, he murmured. It is the only explanation. Someone had a duplicate made. This requires access to the original, even briefly, long enough to take an impression. Impossible, Doranis said flatly. The key is always with me. Poirot straightened and looked at him with that expression of courteous skepticism I knew so well. Monsieur Doranis, I've learned in my long career that the word impossible is usually a synonym for I prefer not to consider the alternative. You sleep, do you not? You bathe. The key rests upon your bedside table, perhaps, or hangs in your dressing room while you attend to your toilet. A muscle worked in Doranis's jaw. My valet, he said slowly. My valet would have had access. His name? Stavros. Stavros Michaelidis. He has been with me for 20 years. I shall wish to speak with him. Doranis's expression darkened. You cannot. Stavros disappeared on Tuesday morning, the day after the theft. He left no note. He took nothing from his room except a small leather bag. The silence that followed was very full indeed. And this, Poirot said quietly, is what you have been hiding. Not only this. Doranis returned to the fireplace and gripped the mantelpiece with both hands, his back to us. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. Stavros Michaelidis is not merely my valet. He is my nephew, my sister's son. I brought him from Greece when he was a boy of 15. I educated him. I trusted him. He paused. I loved him as a son. Helena Doranis had moved to her husband's side, but she did not touch him. She stood near, watching his face with an expression of pained tenderness. Alexander believes Stavros stole the dagger, she said. He believes Stavros sold it to Leonard Carew, or attempted to, and he believes that whatever transaction went wrong between them is what got Leonard killed. And is this what you believe, monsieur? Poirot asked. Doranis turned. His eyes were bright. Not with tears, I think, but with the terrible clarity of a man who has been forced to look at something he would rather not see. "What I believe," he said, "is that I have been a fool, and that my foolishness has cost a man his life." We did not leave Eaton Square that evening. Doranis, having once begun to speak, seemed unable to stop, as though the dam of his silence, once breached, released a flood he could no longer contain. Helena ordered dinner brought to the gallery, and over cold chicken and a rather good burgundy, the full picture of Monday's viewing began to emerge. Poirot, seated at the desk with a small notebook before him, extracted the guest list with the patience of a surgeon removing shrapnel. "The 12, he said. "Tell me of each. Begin with those you trust least." Doranis grunted, a sound that might have been amusement. "I trust none of them. That is why I invited them." "Explain, s'il vous plaît." "When you possess something of great value, Monsieur Poirot, you do not surround yourself with strangers. You surround yourself with those who want what you have. You keep them close. You watch them. You learn their weaknesses." He poured more wine. "It is the Greek way." "Very well. Then tell me of those who wanted the dagger most." Doranis counted on his thick fingers. "First, Sir Edmund Hale, retired diplomat. Served in Constantinople, Istanbul as they now call it, for 15 years. He considers himself the foremost authority on Ottoman arms in England. He offered me £30,000 for the dagger last year. I refused. And his temperament? Cold. Precise. The sort of Englishman who would murder you with perfect manners and then complain that you had bled upon his carpet. I bristled slightly at the characterization, but Poirot merely nodded. Continue. Second, Mrs. Vera Lascelles, a widow. Her late husband, Gerald Lascelles, was a collector of similar tastes to my own. She inherited his collections and has been selling it piece by piece. She claims poverty, but I have my doubts. She wanted the dagger, not to keep, I think, but to sell. She has a buyer. You know this? Leonard told me. 3 weeks ago he said Vera Lascelles had approached him about finding a buyer for a piece of extraordinary quality that she expected to acquire soon. He thought nothing of it at the time. Now. Doranis left the sentence unfinished. Third, Captain Marcus Doyle, an Irishman, charming, reckless, perpetually in debt. He has no interest in antiquities. He was a present because he is Helena's cousin. Doranis glanced at his wife. She insisted. Helena met his look steadily. Marcus is family. Marcus is a liability. Poirot made a note. And the remaining 9. Professor Theodore Brinsley, curator of Near Eastern antiquities at the Ashmolean. A bore, but a genuine scholar. His wife, Margaret Brinsley, a mousy woman who lives in terror of her husband's opinions. The Honourable Rupert Challis, younger son of Lord Ingham, another collector, though his tastes run to paintings rather than weapons. His companion, a Mr. Philip Anstruther, who is something in the city and whose function at these events is to look prosperous and say little. This Mr. Anstruther. What is his connection to the world of antiquities? None, so far as I know. He is Challis's creature. His advisor, his secretary, his shadow. Challis does not move without him. Interesting. Continue. Dr. Nadia Kazarian, Armenian, a physician, but also a historian. She has written extensively on the Ottoman conquest. She was the only guest who seemed more interested in the dagger's history than its value. Doranis paused. I liked her. That is noted. The others? My solicitor, Henry Blackstone. He was there in a professional capacity. I wished him to witness the provenance documents for the Iznik tiles. His wife, Dorothy, accompanied him. Neither has the slightest interest in daggers, jeweled or otherwise. And finally, the dead man. Leonard Carew. Poirot set down his pen. 12 guests, 1 dagger, 1 murder. He looked up. and one missing valet, who is also your nephew. You see my difficulty. I see more than your difficulty, monsieur. I see a web, and at its center, not one spider, but perhaps several. He rose and moved to the empty display case. Tell me precisely how the evening proceeded, the sequence of events. Omit nothing. Doranis closed his eyes, assembling the memory. Guests arrived from 7:30. Drinks in the drawing room downstairs. Champagne, whiskey, the usual. Helena received them. I came down at 8 and led them up here, to the gallery. The Isnik tiles were displayed on the central table. He gestured to a long mahogany surface that now bore only a cloth. I spoke about their provenance for perhaps 40 minutes. Questions followed. Then we descended for dinner. During your talk, the dagger was in its case. Yes, I remember glancing at it several times. A habit. And the case was locked? Yes. You are certain? Doranis opened his eyes. I am certain because Sir Edmund Hale asked to examine the dagger, and I refused. I told him the case would remain locked for the evening. He was displeased. Poirot's mustache twitched. He asked, and you refused? This was before dinner. Yes, during the presentation. And after dinner. We returned to the gallery for coffee and brandy at approximately 10 o'clock. I noticed the case was still closed. At 10:30, the guests began to leave. I escorted the last, Henry Blackstone and his wife, to the door at 11:15. When I returned to the gallery, the case was open. The case was open, the velvet impression was bare, and the dagger was gone. Poirot was silent for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, between 10 o'clock and 11:15, 45 minutes, the dagger was taken while you and your guests were all in this room. Yes. Then the thief is bold, monsieur. Extraordinarily bold. To open a locked case in a room full of people, remove an object of considerable size, and conceal it upon their person. This requires nerve, skill, and above all, a plan prepared in advance. Or an accomplice, Helena said. Poirot turned to her. You are thinking of your cousin, madame? She flushed. No, You're thinking of someone. The thought arrived before I spoke. You have a suspicion you have not yet voiced. Helena glanced at her husband, then back at Poirot. The lights, she said. Explain. When we returned to the gallery after dinner, the lights, the electric lights, flickered. Twice. Alexander complained to Stavros, who said there had been trouble with the fuse box. It was perhaps 30 seconds of near darkness. And in those 30 seconds, Poirot murmured, a skilled hand could have opened a case and removed its contents. But the key, I began. The key, Hastings, is no longer the mystery. The mystery is the 30 seconds. He turned to Doranis. This fuse box, where is it located? In the basement, the servants' level. And Stavros? He was the one who investigated the fault. Yes. How long was he absent from the gallery? Doranis's face changed. I watched the realization settle upon him like a physical weight. Perhaps 5 minutes, he said hoarsely. He went down to check the fuses. When he returned, he said a wire had come loose. He had repaired it. 5 minutes, Poirot repeated. Long enough to loosen a fuse, cause a momentary darkness in the room above, and signal to an accomplice. Someone who was waiting, who knew the case, who had a duplicate key ready in their hand. The room felt very cold. Doranis sat heavily in his chair, and for the first time he looked every one of his 62 years. You think Stavros planned it with someone in this room? He said. I think it is more than possible. I think it is certain. Poirot picked up his notebook. Tomorrow, monsieur, I shall interview each of your guests, and tomorrow evening I shall visit the flat of the late Leonard Carew. In the meantime, I ask that you touch nothing in this room and speak to no one about our conversation. He paused at the door. One more question. The dagger itself. You said it was carried at the fall of Constantinople. Is this provenance authenticated? Beyond doubt. I have the documentation, letters of transfer, Ottoman records, the testimony of the Istanbul dealer who sold it. And the jewels in the hilt? Rubies. 7 rubies, set in a gold filigree mount around a grip of carved walrus ivory. The blade is Damascus steel, folded, tempered, still sharp enough to cut silk after 500 years. Sharp enough, Poirot said softly, to cut a great deal more than silk. We visited Leonard Carew's flat the following morning. It occupied the 2nd floor of a Georgian building in Russell Square, a good address for a man in the antiquities trade, close enough to the British Museum to suggest scholarly respectability, and far enough from the auction houses to imply independence. Inspector Sullivan of Scotland Yard had agreed, with some reluctance, to admit Poirot to the scene. Sullivan was a large, phlegmatic man with the placid exterior of a dairy farmer and the mind of a chess player. He had worked with Poirot once before, on the Hartington diamond affair, and retained a grudging respect for the Belgian's methods. "Nothing's been moved," Sullivan said, leading us up the narrow staircase. "The housekeeper found him yesterday morning at 9. She comes 3 times a week. The body was on the floor of the study, stabbed once through the chest." The flat was surprisingly large. A sitting room, a study, a bedroom, and a small kitchen. Every surface was cluttered with the paraphernalia of the trade: catalogues, auction records, correspondence in 6 languages, and everywhere, objects. Small bronzes, fragments of marble, a Byzantine icon propped against a stack of books. The air smelled of dust, old paper, and beneath it, the faint, sour sweetness of death. The study was where it had happened. A dark stain marked the carpet before the desk. A good Turkish carpet, I noted, which Leonard Carew would have appreciated as much as any man. The desk itself was in disorder, drawers pulled open, papers scattered. "Robbery?" I suggested. "Could be," Sullivan said. "But the obvious valuables, that icon in the sitting room, a gold pocket watch, £60 in notes in the bedroom drawer, untouched. If it was robbery, the thief was looking for something specific." Poirot moved through the room with his characteristic delicacy, touching nothing, seeing everything. He paused at the desk and examined the scattered papers. "Correspondence," he murmured. "Bills of sale. Provenance certificates." He looked up. "Inspector, the murder weapon. It has been recovered." Sullivan shook his head. "That's the curious part. No weapon at the scene. The killer took it with him. The wound. You said stabbed through the chest. The nature of the blade." Sullivan consulted his notebook. "Pathologist says a narrow blade, double-edged, approximately 8 inches long. Entered between the 4th and 5th ribs. Death would have been almost instantaneous." He looked at Poirot. "Something like a stiletto, or a dagger," Poirot said. "An antique dagger. Ottoman, perhaps?" Sullivan's eyes narrowed. "You know something." "I know many things, Inspector. What I do not yet know is which of them are relevant." He moved to the window which overlooked the square. "The door. Was it forced?" "No. Either Carew admitted his killer, or the killer had a key. The housekeeper, does she possess a key?" "She does. But she was in Croydon on the night in question, visiting her sister." "Confirmed." Poirot nodded absently. He was examining the mantelpiece, upon which stood several framed photographs. He picked one up, a formal portrait of a group at some social gathering. I recognized Doranis, heavy and commanding, and beside him, Helena, luminous in evening dress. And there, to the left, standing slightly apart from the group, "Carew," I said. "And next to him, who is that woman?" Poirot held the photograph to the light. The woman in question was handsome, perhaps 45, with strong features and dark hair shot with silver. She wore a high-collared dress that suggested both taste and austerity, and her expression, caught mid-glance, was directed not at the camera, but at someone out of frame with an intensity that struck me as almost fierce. "Interesting," Poirot murmured. He turned the frame over. On the back, in pencil, Eaton Square, March 1935, a DHDLCNKSHVL. "NK," I said. "Nadia Kazarian? And VL, Vera Lascelles, SH, Sir Edmund Hale, perhaps?" Poirot replaced the photograph. A gathering of the same circle, the same orbits, the same gravitational pulls. He opened the desk's central drawer, which Sullivan had not yet touched. Inside, beneath a sheaf of invoices, lay a small leather notebook. Poirot opened it, and his eyebrows rose. "Ah," he said. This is very interesting indeed." "What is it?" Sullivan and I spoke simultaneously. The notebook contained a list of names and figures. Not sales records, something else. Against each name was a date, a sum, and a single word or phrase. I read over Poirot's shoulder. A D, January 1929. £4,000. Provenance adjusted. VL, March 1931. £2,500. Certificate fabricated. SEH, November 1933. £6,000. Attribution altered. RC, August 1935. £1,500. History invented. Poirot looked up at Sullivan. Leonard Carew was not merely a dealer. He was a forger, a fabricator of histories. He created false provenances for objects whose true origins could not bear scrutiny. He tapped the notebook, and this is his ledger of sins. The initials AD is Alexander Doranis. VL is Vera Lascelles. SEH is Sir Edmund Hale. RC, Rupert Challis. "Good God," I said, "he was a blackmailer as well." "Perhaps. Or perhaps he kept this as insurance. Protection against the day when one of his clients decided that a dead forger tells no tales." Poirot's expression was grave. "The killer took the weapon but left this notebook. Either they did not find it, or they did not know it existed." Sullivan reached for the notebook. "I'll need that as evidence." "Of course. But I should like to examine it more closely. There are entries here that—" Poirot stopped. He had turned to the last page, upon which a single entry had been written in a hand less steady than the rest, as though hurried or afraid. "Monday. The dagger is wrong. God help me, it has always been wrong." The silence in that dusty room stretched for a very long time. "Wrong," Poirot repeated softly. "The dagger is wrong." He looked at me, and I saw in his eyes that particular gleam, the gleam of a man who has glimpsed the shape of a truth that others cannot yet perceive. "Hastings," he said, "I begin to see, and what I see is not what I expected." The next 2 days were consumed by interviews. Poirot conducted them with his customary blend of courtesy and ruthlessness, each conversation a miniature performance in which the subject believed themselves to be the audience, never suspecting they were the show. Sir Edmund Hale received us in his study in Kensington, a panelled room that smelled of leather and ambition. He was precisely as Doranis had described, cold, correct, with the clipped diction of a man who had served the crown in difficult places and considered all subsequent difficulties trivial by comparison. "Leonard Carew was a rogue," he said, without hesitation and without regret. "A useful rogue, as rogues sometimes are, but a rogue nonetheless. He knew the market better than any man alive, and he was not always particular about the truth. You employed his services? On occasion, for authentication, he had an eye that I respected, even if I did not always trust his character. And the entry in his notebook against your name. Attribution altered." Hale's expression did not change. "I have no idea what you're referring to." "I am referring to a transaction in 1933. £6,000, an attribution altered by Carew on your behalf. For the first time, something moved behind those pale grey eyes. If such a document exists, it is a fabrication. Carew was capable of anything, including being murdered. That would appear to be one capability he exercised only once. Hale permitted himself a thin smile. I did not kill him, Monsieur Poirot. I had no need to. The man was useful to me alive. So everyone tells me, Poirot murmured. It is remarkable how useful this dead man was to so many living ones. Mrs. Vera Lascelles was another matter entirely. She received us in a drawing-room in Chelsea that was slowly being emptied. Blank spaces on the walls where paintings had hung, gaps on shelves where objects had stood. The room had the melancholy air of a life being liquidated. She was a small, sharp-featured woman of 50, with quick, intelligent eyes and hands that moved constantly, adjusting a cushion, straightening a frame, smoothing her skirt, as though stillness were an enemy she could not afford to let approach. I won't pretend to grieve for Leonard, she said. He was a useful man and a dangerous one. He knew things about everyone in the trade, who had bought forgeries, who had sold stolen pieces, who had adjusted a provenance to suit a buyer. And about you, madame. What did he know? She met Poirot's gaze without flinching. That I sold a piece 2 years ago whose history was, shall we say, enhanced. Leonard arranged the sale. The buyer was satisfied. No one was harmed. Except the truth. The truth, Monsieur Poirot, is a luxury I can no longer afford. She gestured at the diminished room. Gerald's collection was magnificent. Gerald's debts were more so. I have been selling everything I can, piece by piece, to avoid bankruptcy. When I heard about the Durrani's dagger, when I heard rumors that it might be available. She stopped. You approached Carew about finding a buyer. Yes, but not because I expected to steal it. I believed. She hesitated. There were whispers that Durranis was in financial difficulty himself, that he might sell quietly, through a private channel. I wanted to be positioned to facilitate the sale. And who was your buyer? For the first time, Vera Lascelles looked uncomfortable. I cannot say. You refuse? I am unable. The approach was made through an intermediary. I was told only that the buyer was foreign, Middle Eastern, and willing to pay considerably more than Durranis had originally spent. Poirot absorbed this. And Captain Doyle, the Irishman, Madame Durranis's cousin. What do you know of him? Something changed in her expression. A softening, a flicker of warmth quickly suppressed. Marcus Doyle is a fool, a charming, reckless, hopelessly indebted fool. She paused. He owes money to people who do not send polite reminders. He was desperate enough to do almost anything. Including theft? Including asking a woman he barely knows to help him get close to a dagger worth £40,000. She looked at Poirot directly. He approached me 3 weeks before the viewing. He proposed a scheme. He would create a distraction. I would take the dagger. We would split the proceeds. And you agreed? I refused. Emphatically. And yet you attended the viewing. Because Alexander invited me. And because I wanted to see Marcus fail. Poirot rose. You are more honest than most of my witnesses, madame. I am grateful. I am too tired for dishonesty, monsieur. It requires energy I no longer possess. Captain Marcus Doyle, by contrast, appeared to possess limitless energy. We found him at his club, a rather disreputable establishment in Jermyn Street, where he occupied a chair by the fire, with the easy grace of a man born to comfort and perpetually denied it. He was younger than I expected, perhaps 35, with dark, curly hair, an engaging smile, and the kind of blue eyes that make women forgive things they ought not to forgive. He wore a suit that had been expensive once and was now carefully maintained. Brushed, pressed, its fraying cuffs turned and re-sewn. "Ah, the great Poirot!" he cried, springing to his feet. Helena said you'd come. I've been expecting you. Sit down, sit down. Whiskey? No. Sensible man. You know why I'm here, Captain. The dagger, of course. Rotten business. He shook his head with convincing sorrow, and poor old Leonard on top of it. Dreadful. You knew Monsieur Carew? Slightly. Met him at Helena's dinner parties. He was one of those dry, watchful chaps who always seem to be taking notes on everyone else. Rather unsettling, really. Mrs. Lascelles tells me you approached her with a proposal to steal the dagger. The smile did not waver, but something behind it tightened. Did she? Well, Vera always did have a flair for the dramatic. I may have, in the loosest possible terms, suggested a hypothetical scenario, a sort of intellectual exercise. What would one do if one were inclined? Captain, Poirot's voice was gentle but immovable. A man is dead. This is not a game. The smile faded. Doyle leaned forward, and for a moment the mask dropped, revealing beneath it something surprisingly serious and surprisingly afraid. I need money, Monsieur Poirot. Badly. There are men to whom I owe sums that— He swallowed. Yes, I thought about taking the dagger. I'd be lying if I said otherwise. But thinking and doing are different things, and on Monday evening I did not take it. Where were you when the lights went out? Standing beside the window, talking to Philip and Struther about racing. He'll confirm it. And on the night Leonard Carew was killed. At a poker game in Soho. 6 witnesses, all of them thoroughly disreputable, which means they'll remember perfectly. Poirot studied him. Your debts? To whom do you owe? Doyle's face closed like a shutter. That I cannot tell you. Cannot or will not? Will not. These are not people one names to a detective, Monsieur Poirot. Not unless one wishes to find oneself at the bottom of the Thames. We left the club in silence. In the taxi, Poirot sat with his eyes closed, his fingertips pressed together. Well, I said, do you believe him? I believe he is frightened, Poirot said, and I believe his fear is genuine. A man who lies about his debts may lie about many things, but a man who refuses to name his creditors, that man is telling the truth about the danger. He opened his eyes. There is one more person I must see before the picture is complete, Hastings. Dr. Nadia Kazarian, the Armenian scholar. Yes, the one guest about whom Durrani said, I liked her. It is always the liked ones, mon ami, who surprise us most. Doctor. Nadia Kazarian occupied a small flat above a bookshop in Marchmont Street, within walking distance of the British Museum. The flat was modest, a far cry from Eaton Square, but immaculately ordered, its walls lined with books in English, French, Armenian, Turkish, and Arabic. A desk by the window held a half-finished manuscript, a pot of ink, and a magnifying glass. The room smelled of strong coffee and old paper, the scent of a life devoted to study. She was perhaps 50, with a strong, handsome face and dark eyes that assessed Poirot with the steady regard of a woman accustomed to weighing evidence. Her hair, dark shot through with silver, was pulled back simply. She wore no jewelry except a small gold cross at her throat. I wondered when you would come, she said, gesturing us to chairs. Alexander has engaged you, I assume. His wife. A flicker of surprise. Helena. Yes, I should have guessed. Alexander would never have admitted weakness voluntarily. You know him well? I've known him for 12 years. We met at a conference in Athens. He was interested in my research on Ottoman weaponry, particularly the ceremonial daggers of the Mehmed period. She paused. I authenticated the Durrani's dagger when he purchased it in 1928. You were the authenticating scholar. I was. Poirot leaned forward. Then tell me, Dr. Kazarian, the last entry in Leonard Carew's notebook. The dagger is wrong. It has always been wrong. What did he mean? I had not expected the effect these words produced. Doctor. Kazarian's composure did not crack. It shattered. She rose abruptly from her chair, moved to the window, and stood there with her back to us, her hands gripping the sill. "He found out," she whispered. "After all these years, Leonard found out." "Found out what?" She turned. Her face was very pale, and her eyes held something I can only describe as the expression of a woman who has carried a weight for a very long time and is now, finally, reluctantly, setting it down. "The Durrani's dagger is genuine," she said. "The blade is authentic 15th century Damascus steel. The craftsmanship is beyond question. But the jewels," she drew a breath. "The rubies in the hilt are not original. They are replacements, superb replacements, the finest I have ever seen, but replacements nonetheless. The original rubies were removed sometime before the dagger came to market in Istanbul." "And you knew this in 1928? "I suspected it. The mounting showed microscopic evidence of resetting, but the stones themselves were genuine rubies of extraordinary quality. The age of the mounting was consistent with the 15th century. The evidence was ambiguous." "Ambiguous," Poirot repeated. "And yet you authenticated the piece." She stopped. Her hands twisted. "Alexander wanted it so badly. He had traveled to Istanbul himself. He had spent months tracing its history. The blade was genuine. That I could confirm absolutely. The overall age and construction were beyond doubt. The question of the rubies, it was a matter of interpretation. And you chose to interpret generously." The silence that followed was devastating. Dr. Kazarian sank back into her chair. "I chose wrong," she said. "I have known it for 8 years. Every time I see Alexander, every time he speaks of the dagger with that terrible pride, I know." Her voice dropped. "The original rubies were almost certainly removed during the Ottoman decline, when treasury pieces were quietly stripped and their jewels sold. The replacements were made in the 19th century. Exquisite work, but not original. The dagger, as authenticated, is worth perhaps £40,000. Without the original rubies, as a blade with replacement stones, it is worth perhaps 8,000, I said. "Not 40. Not 40, she confirmed. Poirot was very still. "And Leonard Carew discovered this?" "He must have. He was examining the collection 3 weeks ago. Doranis asked him to prepare insurance valuations. Leonard had a jeweler's loupe that he carried everywhere. If he looked closely enough at the settings—" She shook her head. "He would have seen what I saw, what I chose not to report. And if he confronted Doranis, Alexander would have been destroyed. His reputation, his standing in the collecting world, everything he has built over 30 years, founded upon a centerpiece that was overvalued by a factor of 5. Her eyes met Poirot's. "But there is more, Monsieur Poirot. Something I have not told you. Tell me now." "The dagger was sold to Alexander by a dealer in Istanbul named Kemal Yilmaz. Yilmaz claimed to have acquired it from a private source, a descendant of the Ottoman court. But I have since learned that Yilmaz was connected to a smuggling network that dealt in looted antiquities. The dagger may not merely be misattributed. It may have been stolen, taken from the Topkapi Palace collection decades ago and passed through a chain of illicit hands before reaching the legitimate market. If this were proven, Alexander would face criminal prosecution. The Turkish government has been demanding the return of stolen antiquities for years. If they learned the Doranis dagger was palace property, they would demand its return, and Doranis would be exposed as either a knowing buyer of stolen goods or the victim of a fraud." Poirot's voice was soft. "Either way, he is ruined." "Yes. And Leonard Carew knew all of this." "I believe he was assembling the evidence. The notebook entry, 'The dagger is wrong,' suggests he had confirmed the ruby substitution. Whether he knew about the Topkapi connection, I cannot say." Poirot rose. "Dr. Kazarian, I thank you for your honesty. It cannot have been easy. It has been 8 years of dishonesty, Monsieur Poirot. The easy part was lying. The hard part was stopping. As we descended the staircase, I turned to Poirot. The motive has shifted completely. It's no longer about who stole the dagger. It's about who was willing to kill to keep the dagger's secret. Precisely, Hastings. And consider, whoever killed Leonard Carew took the murder weapon with them. A blade described by the pathologist as antique, Ottoman, and jeweled. He paused on the landing. What if the stolen dagger and the murder weapon are one and the same? Then the thief is also the murderer? Or the thief gave the dagger to the murderer, or the murderer took it from the thief. His mustache twitched. The web tightens, mon ami, and somewhere at its center, a spider waits. The search for Stavros Michaelidis occupied Inspector Sullivan's men for the better part of 3 days. Poirot, characteristically, declined to participate in the physical search. "I do not chase," he informed me. "I sit, I think. The quarry comes to me." In this instance, the quarry came not to Poirot, but to a boarding house in Limehouse, where a Greek sailor matching Stavros's description had taken a room under the name Petridis. Sullivan's men found him on Saturday morning, huddled on a narrow bed in a room that smelled of salt and fear. We were summoned to Scotland Yard, where Stavros had been brought for questioning. I'd expected a villainous figure, the sort of swarthy desperado that populates the cheaper kind of thriller. Instead, I found a young man of perhaps 25, with the same heavy build as his uncle and the same dark eyes, but with something altogether gentler in his face. A quality of bewilderment, as though the world had presented him with a problem he was not equipped to solve. He looked up as Poirot entered the interview room, and his expression shifted from dull misery to something like hope. "You are Poirot," he said. His English was good, accented but fluent. "My uncle spoke of you. He said you were the only honest man he had ever met. Your uncle is generous, but honesty, it demands reciprocity. Will you be honest with me, Monsieur Michaelidis?" Stavros nodded. He looked exhausted, the deep, bone-level exhaustion of a man who has been running and has finally stopped. "I took the key," he said. "My uncle's key. I took an impression, wax, while he slept. 3 weeks ago, I had a copy made by a locksmith in Clerkenwell. On whose instructions? No one's." Stavros's jaw tightened. "It was my idea. My uncle. He's a proud man, a stubborn man. For 2 years I have watched him grow old. His shipping business is failing. He has debts he will not admit. Helena, Mrs. Doranis, she knows, but she cannot make him listen. He would rather die than sell the collection. So you decided to sell the dagger for him? To save him. I thought if the dagger disappeared, if it could be sold quietly through Leonard, my uncle would collect the insurance and be free." Poirot studied him. A noble motive, if a criminal one. But the plan required an accomplice, someone inside the room to take the dagger during the moment of darkness you created. Stavros's face twisted. Leonard. It was always Leonard. He knew a buyer. Someone willing to pay 50,000. More than insurance would have covered. The plan was simple. I would cause the lights to fail. Leonard would open the case during the darkness and conceal the dagger beneath his coat. After the viewing, he would take it to the buyer. I would receive 10,000. My uncle would receive the insurance claim. And the flaw in this plan? The flaw, Stavros's voice cracked, the flaw is that Leonard was greedy. He took the dagger. Yes, but he did not bring it to me. He did not contact the buyer. He disappeared. For 2 days. No word. No message. And then he was dead. You believe Leonard intended to keep the dagger, to sell it himself and cheat you? I don't know what I believe. I only know that when I heard he was dead, I ran. I was afraid the police would connect me to the theft, afraid that whoever killed Leonard would come for me next. And who do you believe killed Leonard Carew? Stavros looked at Poirot with the desperate clarity of a man who has thought of nothing else for days. "The buyer," he said. "Leonard was supposed to deliver the dagger to the buyer on Tuesday. When he didn't, when he tried to negotiate a higher price or cut me out or whatever fool thing he attempted, the buyer killed him and took it." "This buyer, do you know their identity?" "No, Leonard never told me. He said it was safer that way." Stavros laughed, a hollow, terrible sound. "Safer." Poirot thanked him, and we left Scotland Yard in a taxi. The November fog had cleared temporarily, revealing a London of sharp edges and pale sunlight. "Do you believe his story?" I asked. "I believe the shape of it," Poirot said. "The details may be arranged differently than he presents them, but the essential truth, that Stavros took the key, that Carew took the dagger, that the plan went wrong, this I accept. Then the killer is this mysterious buyer. Perhaps." But Poirot's tone carried the weight of doubt. "And yet, Hastings, consider, the buyer is a phantom, a figure known only to a dead man." "How convenient. When the trail grows cold, a phantom appears to absorb the blame." "You think the buyer is one of the 12 guests?" "I think the buyer has always been closer than anyone imagines. He fell silent, and I knew better than to press him." When Poirot retreats into himself, the little grey cells are at their most active, and the wisest course is patience. Poirot's request arrived by hand-delivered note on Sunday morning. All parties were to assemble at 14 Eaton Square at 8 o'clock that evening. The note was addressed to Alexander Doranis, but carbon-copied, in Poirot's immaculate hand, to Inspector Sullivan, and it carried the particular authority of a man who has made up his mind. "You know who did it," I said as he adjusted his tie before the mirror. "I know who did everything, Hastings. The theft, the murder, the lies that surrounded both. What remains is to prove it, and proof in this case requires confession. And if the killer doesn't confess, then the killer is a fool, and I do not think this killer is a fool." He turned from the mirror. "I think this killer is the cleverest person in the room, which is why they will confess, because clever people cannot resist explaining how clever they have been." We arrived at Eaton Square to find the gallery already occupied. Doranis stood by the empty display case like a sentinel at a fallen comrade's grave. Helena sat nearby, her hands folded, her face composed but watchful. Inspector Sullivan occupied a chair by the door with 2 plainclothes constables stationed in the hallway outside. The guests arrived in 1s and 2s. Sir Edmund Hale, stiff and suspicious. Mrs. Vera Lascelles, nervous, her hands never still. Captain Marcus Doyle, who attempted a joke about condemned men and last suppers that fell into silence like a stone into a well. Professor Brinsley and his wife, bewildered and indignant. The Honourable Rupert Challis and the ever-present Anstruther. And finally, Dr. Nadia Kazarian, who entered quietly, took a seat apart from the others, and watched Poirot with the steady gaze of a woman who knew what was coming. Stavros Michaelidis was absent, still in custody at Scotland Yard. Poirot took his position before the fireplace. The gallery's lights were bright, no convenient darkness tonight, and the display cases gleamed along the walls like a jury of glass and gold. "Mesdames, Messieurs," he began, "I thank you for attending. I shall not waste your time with preamble. You are here because a dagger was stolen and a man was killed, and these 2 events, which some have labored to keep separate, are in truth one crime, committed for one purpose, by one person in this room." The effect was immediate. Backs straightened, hands tightened, eyes darted. "Let me tell you a story," Poirot continued. "It begins not on Monday evening, but 8 years ago, in Istanbul, where a Greek shipping magnate purchases a jeweled dagger said to have been carried at the fall of Constantinople. He pays £40,000. He has it authenticated by a scholar of impeccable credentials. His gaze touched Dr. Kazarian, who did not flinch, but the authentication conceals a truth. The rubies in the hilt are not original. They are 19th century replacements, superb in quality but fraudulent in provenance. The dagger, correctly valued, is worth perhaps £8,000. Doranis made a sound, something between a gasp and a growl. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying, monsieur, that you were cheated, whether knowingly or not. We shall come to that. But cheated you were. And this fact, dormant for 8 years, was recently discovered by Leonard Carew, a man whose profession required him to know the difference between a genuine ruby and a magnificent fake. Leonard knew. Doranis's face was grey. He knew and said nothing to me. He said nothing because the knowledge was worth more as a secret than as a revelation. Carew was many things: dealer, authenticator, forger of provenances. He was also, I regret to say, a man who collected other people's vulnerabilities the way you collect antiquities. His notebook, recovered by Inspector Sullivan from his flat, documents years of falsified attributions, fabricated certificates, and adjusted provenances. Against your name, Monsieur Doranis, against Sir Edmund's, against Mrs. Lascelles. He kept meticulous records of every favor, every compromise, every lie. Insurance, Sir Edmund murmured. The man kept insurance. Précisément. But insurance, like any weapon, is only effective if one remains alive to use it. And Carew, 3 weeks before the viewing, discovered something that changed the equation entirely. Something that made the dagger not merely overvalued, but potentially criminal. The top-copy connection, Dr. Kazarian said quietly. Every head turned. Dr. Kazarian refers to evidence suggesting the dagger may have been stolen from the Topkapi Palace collection in Istanbul, looted during a period of instability, and passed through a chain of illicit dealers before reaching the legitimate market. Poirot paused. If proven, this would expose Monsieur Doranis to criminal prosecution, international scandal, and the loss of his entire collection. It would destroy him. Doranis had gone very still. Helena reached for his hand, and this time he took it. Now, Poirot continued, imagine you are Leonard Carew. You possess knowledge that could ruin one of the wealthiest collectors in London. What do? You do not confront him. Not yet. You wait. You plan. You approach Stavros Michaelides, the nephew, the insider, with a proposition. Steal the dagger. Remove it from Doranis's possession before the truth can be discovered by others. Sell it to a foreign buyer who will take it out of the country, beyond the reach of Turkish authorities. Everyone profits. Doranis collects insurance. Stavros receives a payment, and Carew takes his commission and his secret to the grave. But it went wrong, I said. It went catastrophically wrong. Because Carew, you see, was not the only person who knew the truth about the rubies. Poirot's voice hardened. He was not even the first. The silence in the gallery was absolute. 8 years ago in Istanbul, the dealer Kemal Yilmaz sold the dagger to Monsieur Doranis for £40,000. The authentication was provided by Dr. Kazarian, but there was a third party involved in the transaction, a party who has remained invisible until now. He turned to face the far end of the room, where Vera Lascelles sat with her hands folded, her face as white as the pearl at her throat. Mrs. Lascelles, Poirot said. Or should I say, Madame Yilmaz. The name detonated like a bomb. Doranis staggered. Helena gripped his arm. Even Sullivan, that monument of phlegm, sat forward in his chair. Vera Lascelles did not move. She sat very straight, very still, and looked at Poirot with an expression that was almost admiring. How long have you known? She asked. Since yesterday evening, when I examined the marriage records at Somerset House. Vera Yilmaz, née Barrett, married Kemal Yilmaz in Istanbul in 1919. Divorced in 1924. married Gerald Lascelles in London in 1926. The connection to the dealer who sold the dagger, as it was not difficult to find, once I knew where to look. Then you know everything. I know that you arranged the sale, that Kamal, your first husband, was the front man, but you were the architect. You sourced the dagger. You arranged the replacement of the rubies, keeping the originals, which you later sold independently for a sum I estimate at £20,000. You brought in Dr. Kazarian to authenticate the piece, knowing that the doctor's ambiguity about the stones would not extend to outright denial. Dr. Kazarian's face had gone ashen. You knew, she whispered to Vera. You knew the rubies were false because you replaced them yourself. I needed the money, Vera said. Her voice was steady, eerily so. Gerald's debts were drowning us. The original rubies were worth a fortune on their own. The dagger with replacement stones was still genuine enough to command a massive price from the right buyer. A buyer you selected with care, Poirot said. Doranis, proud, acquisitive, desperate to possess something that would validate his ascent from the docks of Piraeus to the salons of Eaton Square. He would not question too closely. He would not look too hard. And he didn't. Something cold had entered Vera's expression. For 8 years he didn't. But Leonard Carew did. Leonard always looked too closely. It was his gift and his curse. She closed her eyes. He came to me 3 weeks ago. He had examined the rubies under magnification and detected the resetting. He wanted £20,000 to keep silent. Blackmail. Survival. Her eyes opened. I had nothing left to give him. Gerald's collection was nearly gone. The proceeds from the original rubies were spent years ago. I was destitute. And so you devised a different plan, Poirot said. Not payment, but elimination. You could not silence Carew with money, so you silenced him permanently. You encouraged Stavros's scheme through Carew. The theft, the foreign buyer, knowing that once the dagger was in Carew's possession, you would visit him, retrieve it, and ensure he never spoke again. I did not. You visited his flat on Tuesday evening. You brought no weapon because the weapon was already there, the dagger itself, stolen from this very case the night before. Carew showed it to you. Perhaps he gloated. Perhaps he demanded a larger sum. It does not matter. You took the dagger from his hands, and you drove it through his heart. Vera Lascelles stood. She was trembling now, but her voice remained controlled. You cannot prove this. I can prove that you were at Carew's flat on Tuesday evening. The doorman of the building identified your photograph this morning. I can prove that the murder weapon matches the dimensions of the Doranis dagger. I can prove that the foreign buyer you described to Carew and to Stavros never existed. It was a fiction, designed to explain the dagger's disappearance after you reclaimed it. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in tissue paper. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a single ruby, dark as blood, no larger than a thumbnail, but catching the gallery's light with a fire that seemed almost alive. This ruby, Poirot said, was recovered this afternoon from a jeweler in Hatton Garden, to whom you attempted to sell it yesterday. It is one of the 7 original rubies from the Doranis dagger, the rubies you removed 8 years ago and have been selling one by one to fund your survival. Vera stared at the ruby. Then she looked at Poirot, and in that look I saw the final collapse of a woman who had been fighting for too long. He was going to ruin everything, she said. Her voice was barely audible. Not just me, everyone. Alexander, Nadia, the entire circle. Leonard didn't want money. He wanted power. He wanted to own us all. And so you killed him. And so I freed us. Her chin lifted. You call it murder. I call it the only choice I had left. Sullivan rose from his chair. Mrs. Lascelles, he said with that careful courtesy of the English policeman, I must ask you to accompany me. She went without struggle, without tears. At the door, she paused and looked back. Not at Poirot, not at Doranis, but at the empty display case where the dagger had once gleamed in its fraudulent glory. "It was beautiful, though," she said, "even without the rubies. The blade was real. That was always real." And then she was gone. The aftermath of Vera Lascelles' arrest unfolded over the following week with the grim efficiency of the British legal system. Sullivan's men recovered the Durana's dagger from a safety deposit box in Chancery Lane, where Vera had placed it after the murder. The blade was clean. She had washed it with the precision of a woman who understood that evidence clings to the careless. But Poirot had been right. The jeweller in Hatton Garden provided the final, irrefutable link. Alexander Doranis did not attend the proceedings. He remained in his gallery, among his display cases, a man whose world had been revealed as something other than what he believed. The dagger, when it was returned to him by the police, sat in its case once more, but Doranis could not bring himself to lock it. "It is still beautiful," he told Poirot when we visited him for the last time. "The blade, the craftsmanship, the history of the steel itself, that is real." He stared at the dagger through the glass. "But every time I look at those rubies, I will know they are strangers." "And the topkapi question?" Poirot asked gently. Doranis drew himself up. "I have written to the Turkish ambassador. If the blade belongs to the palace collection, it will be returned. I am a collector, Monsieur Poirot, not a thief. The dagger was sold to me in good faith, or what I believed was good faith. If I was deceived, the least I can do is ensure that the deception ends with me." It was, I thought, the most dignified thing I had ever heard him say. Helena walked us to the door. In the hallway, she took Poirot's hand. "Thank you," she said, "not only for solving it, but for making Alexander face the truth. He would never have done so on his own. The truth, madame, is like your husband's dagger. The blade is always real, even when the ornament deceives. It is the blade that matters. The rest is vanity." She smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her. And we stepped out into the London evening. Stavros Michaelidis was charged with conspiracy to commit theft, but, given his cooperation and the mitigating circumstances, faced a lenient sentence. Captain Marcus Doyle settled his debts. How, I never learned, though Helena's intervention was suspected. Sir Edmund Hale retreated into the fortress of his dignity and was heard to remark at his club that the entire affair proved once again that foreigners could not be trusted with English antiques, a statement so magnificently wrong-headed that even I was moved to protest. Dr. Nadia Kazarian resigned her academic positions and published, at her own expense, a monograph on the authentication failures of the interwar antiquities market. It was, by all accounts, a scathing and honest work. I believe it brought her more peace than any number of correct attributions ever had. And Vera Lascelles? She stood trial at the Old Bailey in January of the following year. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Sullivan and Poirot between them had assembled a chain of evidence that left no room for doubt. She was found guilty of murder and sentenced to hang, though the sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment on grounds of diminished responsibility. Poirot followed the case in the newspapers with an expression I could not quite read. On the morning the verdict was announced, he set down the Times and looked at me across the breakfast table. "It is the oldest story, Hastings," he said. "A woman who was clever, a woman who was desperate, a woman who believed that one crime committed in the dark could undo the consequences of another committed in the light. You pity her? I pity the waste. She had intelligence, courage, resourcefulness, qualities that, directed honestly, might have built a life of distinction. Instead, they built a trap." He stirred his chocolate. "The dagger, Hastings. Everyone fought over the jewels. The rubies, the settings, the gold filigree. But the blade, the ancient blade that could still cut silk after 500 years, no one cared about the blade, and the blade was the only part that was real." He raised his cup. "Remember that, mon ami. When the world dazzles you with ornament, look for the steel beneath. That is where the truth lives, and the danger. I looked at my friend. Small, immaculate, his mustache gleaming, his patent leather shoes reflecting the morning light. And thought, as I had thought so many times before, that Hercule Poirot saw the world more clearly than any man I'd ever known. Not because his eyes were sharper, though they were, not because his mind was quicker, though it was, but because he understood, with a compassion that never quite became sentimentality, that human beings are capable of anything, and that the difference between a masterpiece and a forgery is often nothing more than the willingness to look closely. The dagger was returned to its case. The rubies glittered under the gallery lights. And somewhere in Istanbul, I like to imagine, the ghost of a sultan smiled, because the blade, at least, had come home to the truth.